Hello. Let's Bach. It seems like going forever. It started before and it will continue after. We just jump on the wagon. I find Bach's music infinitely beautiful, but I'm not the only one. I find the Bach's music also to be a profoundly introspective music, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I find also that Bach's writing is so elemental that it connects us beyond time periods and styles, instruments or understandings of music. As if the intervals and the perpetual development of the elements that he does develop become this kind of sense of solace for eternity. I find that also to be the case when you listen to music by Bach. In this case, it's the same pattern, 2/16 and an 8th, step by step rising. It's a musical drawing of the psychological experience of trying to rise step by step. And on each step you reach a different chord, a consonant chord or a dissonant chord, a tension into a release, leading to another tension and then another release. Inhaling, exhaling. And it's difficult to define what is the taste of this music. To me, it's like water. It's an element without which we can't do, air. It is true that he somehow, in the detailed writing of the patterns of his groupments of notes, was searching for a certain sense of intemporal, perhaps even perpetuity. For instance, if he takes 4/16 notes, he starts on the second, so that the next group of 4 from the next second, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. They don't stop at 1, but they continue 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then you obtain a sense of endless chain. And you find that to be the case with most music that needs to breathe, that needs to change bow, that needs to play during the exhaling. And in his writing, there is a sense of going beyond that. I wrote it for oboe, for voice, for violin. He still writes continuous lines, layers. It's fantastic to see how he was driven by that sense of eternity, of absolute line. And I find that his music is really bringing solace. If you hear something. He uses ostinato. What is ostinato? It's repeating or staying on a single note. He's trying to escape while bound to the tonic. I think the usage of ostinato in Bach is very striking. Sometimes it's embedded in the melodic line. It's in the top, sometimes it's in the bottom. Suspended or grounded. And then there is the fugue. The gift that keeps on giving, since one subject creates its own answer, generating a contra-subject which goes around it like it would go around the answer. When the third voice comes, this parthenogenesis is like what it is, a cloning in music. The more of the same, the more elevated, risen, and grounded. It seems like in the fugue he took off all ornamentation, decoration, beautification. It's only music that has one purpose, is to elevate the spirit through the mind. In fact, playing a fugue is as challenging for the performer. Often, as a teacher, I know it very well for the memorization for the students. But it's also a challenge for the listener. Bach is challenging us. He comes to us and we have to comprehend all the information that comes in his music. Sometimes it's sketchy and we try to connect only to what apparently is there, especially in the long values, if it's a sang style of music. But you see, sometimes we have to come up with ways to understand. He writes this in half notes and whole notes. But then the fugue subject of B minor of the book 1 is in eighth notes. And the subject is so long and so chromatic. Subjects written in eighth notes or even in 16th notes in terms of the chosen value for notation. That's F major book 2. And because of that, we played faster, at least I do, than in the eighth notes of G sharp minor. But that's arbitrary. The pulse and the pace, the tempo and the motion, the direction and the narration, the line and the horizon line, the driven purpose, as well as just the situation in which to enter in a meditative state, we evacuate all frills, so syncopations, ornamentations, decorations, appoggiaturas, and just play like C sharp minor book 2. Equal values, also 16th notes. Therefore, if we go back to the B minor, in eighth notes, or the E major in whole and half notes, of course we think interpretation would be the length of sound, the organ type or choral style, or the more harpsichord style with short articulations and crisp, quick notes. G major. Or from the other book, G major, in 16th notes. But imagine for a second that we decide that we don't want to be thinking that his notation should influence our tempo choice. Or should we? Depending on the instrument, or which instrument the keyboard, whichever keyboard instrument, imitates. For instance, which bowed instrument. And how does Bach notate the bowings of the bowed instruments? For instance, a sonata for solo violin. And has the fugue. So we see that in that case we have tayatam, parayam, tararam, pam, pam, a pattern of short values by short groupings, but still like syllables of a long word, and many words of a long sentence, and many sentences of a long chapter, and many chapters of a very long book, and many books of a very long storytelling that has no beginning nor end, which I prefer not to read to Nuto for Bach's endings. Let it end, and very often on an upbeat and not on some kind of a conclusion. It is interesting because then we could do the same for this fugue in B minor and try to bow it. And then on the keyboard instrument, we try to imitate a bowed instrument. And therefore, the G sharp minor subject becomes a little more, let's say, I would say, pretty. Is it less meaningful or is it just pretty? In a way, being pretty is beautiful, of course, but to be meaningful doesn't mean it has to be, let's say, ugly or less frivolous. Except the organ. I don't think the other instruments and the piano can do that. Now, should they? And what is the importance of articulation in Bach's own will? Notation, suggestion. Is it only to do with acoustics and the organ with the pipes that resonates without decay? Or is it for the harpsichord that has this blossoming flourishment? Oh, it's arborescence everywhere of the sounds, and they connect by the resonance while decaying. Whenever on the organ they connect by the connection of their continuous resonance. So if on the organ you don't separate in the acoustic with the resonance, you'll hear everything blurry. So you cannot apply the articulation of one keyboard instrument to another one. It doesn't to do so much with the dynamic range, it's to do with the shortness and length of the sound. And is it 2 and 1 on 1 and 2, short and long, long and short? Or 3 separate and then 2 and 1, 1 and 2, or alternate so that you can create a sense of surprise. So which choice to make? Is it only a choice, really, or is it a calling? Does it appeal to you when you start the piece without thinking, what should I do, how should I do, what should I not do, what should I rather do? F major book to the prelude could be... If you separate few while you hold others, you start feeling, hearing, understanding, 3D demonstrating in your performance that is not just one single combined voice, but so the passing tones shouldn't prevail, but they should bridge as they're meant to. The held tones should organize by thirds until they create the full chord. By then the decay would have worked and then erased some of the traces. So you see, this kind of contingencies have to be taken in account when we choose the tempo. Also because we want to find and define in our performance the meaning that we want to convey, not just the prettiness of it or the excitement of it or the drive in it, which it is. Take Book 2, D minor. It's pure energy in the drive. And in G sharp minor, well, it can go in every direction. And you can say, I could also think of playing the D minor then not driven just because it's 16th notes. And I hear more elements, more articulation, more details than if I combine them in a faster tempo and the 16th notes become chords, which they are, arpeggiated, broken. By I don't do that for the first prelude, or should I? When the combined held sounds create, after the flow, in fact, static harmonization. I think Bach is constantly combining the element of the horizontal line and its compatibility with the vertical harmonization. Let's make an experiment. I play for you something. I just made it up. It takes elements from any Bach piece and it connects it with some kind of flow into some kind of imitation that leads to some kind of an interval which ended up in some kind of dissonance that created a sense of some kind of tension and a release. That doesn't mean at all that this is something that I consider being Bach. I'm just saying that when we play the music that we read and we learned, it becomes us. And it's not just his piece, it becomes part of me, you, us. And we have these intervals in us and these patterns in us. That kind of universality of the message of Bach that goes from the interval through the imitation into the pattern of 16th notes that create a sense of, yes, I think, eternity. I find that his music is a flow of water that never ends. And it continues to play in our heads after we heard it or played it. And it continues. It's just sort of like embraces humanity. They all hold hands, all these phrases of Bach, in any way or shape, instrument or level, degree of knowledge. It's easy to start, difficult to complete, but nevertheless, it keeps on giving such meaningful journey for the inner introspection of us. Of course, I think that's why we need Bach. It's some of a way of meditating, yes, reaching a level of spiritual uplifting of our own inner quest. And since I'm a child, how do I express in music when Bach interrupts the silence with a silence? Since the first beat in the subject of this fugue in F minor is a quarter note rest. How do I know when I listen to it and not know the piece that I don't start on the downbeat? Is it just by accenting the D flat to make understand that the downbeat is not the first note? Because once it's finished, when the answer comes in, I have the downbeat with the beginning of the contra subject. But there is no contra subject before the subject. Very often, string players, even if they don't need it, like oboists or singers, inhale before they exhale while playing to give themselves the upbeat together. Sometimes, of course, wind instrument musicians take a breath and then play during the exhaling. But here, the interruption of the silence happens after a silence. How did Bach even think about expressing that? That intensity of the rest from which the sound comes out. It's almost as if the sound interrupts the rest as a solid entity and creeps around in semitones chromatically, then a leap, and then another semitone and another semitone. And the subject only interval is the fourth ascending, and both foreign notes in F minor, of course. Well, of course, there is the leap of the descending sixth. And the struggle of the ascending fourth. I find always difficult to find the right articulation that corresponds to the introspective mood of a fugue when the subject is presented obviously alone, naked. The truth, if there was one. As soon as the other voices come in, they're already surrounded by the ecosystem. Which in a way always bothers me too, because I feel like then when the answer comes in, the contra subject is way too interesting and constantly calls my attention away from the calmly paced answer compared to the subject. And then the purpose of the contra subject is to dress up the patterns and then in a way not to overwhelm the subject or the answer they're serving. In Book 1, in the prelude in B minor, he has this duo of oboes or voices in suspensions, very expressively stretching, and then a pace in the left hand, in continuous eighth notes. On the piano, it's tempting to play all legato. Or perhaps to play the continuo bass separate, so that it allows to hear on top the two parts in their length of sounds even more so. again carving the space between rests and sounds, the notes interrupting the rests spawning the sounds. Or should it be that you combine slurs and separated articulations? By 2 or 3, or perhaps by 4, by 2, off beat or on the beat. And the more you do this articulation, I would say, whimsical situation, the more you attract attention to the bass line, which is supposed to not take away the attention from the two dialoguing voices in long values. Suspensions and releases. Taking the time to hear it inside your head while you prepare how you're going to play it is very important. And then when you play it, you try to bring out the way you thought of it before you play it. A bit like a conductor beating an upbeat that nobody plays in order to define the space of the downbeat on which they will play for the space between the beats to come. Solo pianists don't give themselves beats, but perhaps they should. But it would be ridiculous because you give yourself an upbeat. Perhaps you should just count in your head. Of course you should. One never does enough separate counting from one's own playing, but that's another story. The point is that we imagine the music before we play it. It plays in our head how we'd like it to come out. And then we spend our life practicing in the hope that the gap will narrow between our intention and the result. Perhaps it's meant not to. Run to the horizon line makes you run faster and further in absolute terms, while to the horizon line is still as far away. Is it discouraging? No. It's not discouraging because it's beautiful. It's beautiful because it's meaningful. And we don't always know how to define it to ourselves, but it doesn't matter. By trying to make it better, we better ourselves through the few elements of his music, which are purposely in his writing, not many, so that we don't get distracted too much from the line, from the arrival point of each line. Like the meaning of each sentence, like in German languages, a syntax of the verb is at the end of the sentence in their language. So it creates a sense of tension and expected release by the time you understand if the action is present, past, or future. I'm sure you all, individually or in group, enjoy Bach, to play, to hear, perhaps to pray, just to be. It's like a musical inner garden for our reflection. Each of us has most likely one, in music terms, intimate connection to what Bach means to each of us. It's a very personal rapport. From the beginner pianist who starts with an invention, or the complex chromatic fantasy and fugue, whose, well, chromaticism in minor is to say, because it's all semitones anyway, mostly, more or less, but in chromaticism it's everywhere. That's why it's semitone everywhere. And when he concludes the Fantasia, he drops by diminished sevenths. It's not just dropping by semitones, it's because it's tritones and therefore combined tritones in diminished sevenths. Is that each chord, instead of expecting to bring the answer or the resolution to the tension, creates its own next one. It seems like an endless drop. Since we don't have anyway the original of the manuscript of the piece. But I guess the idea to finish in major is part of the Solace trip. Who knows, perhaps that is a little bit superficial. I think his pieces finishing in minor or major don't have a difference that really touches the level of mood, atmosphere. I think he's equally driven in minor than in major. It's tainted by minor, but not that much. In the sense that I think it's the chromaticism of the semitones all over the place. In a way, most of his works in major keys are not that chromatic, but most of the minor keys works are very chromatic. So the chromatic scale brings or heightens a sense of drama, of tragedy, especially if it's descending, which is more suitable to minor as a mood. I was going to say as a mode, and I wanted to say a mood, yeah. In G minor, in the French style overture, it's as majestic as the C minor partita. I think it's grand as well as noble and majestic, and it doesn't have to be per se in major. The third one is to him so much. I think he wrote beyond major and minor. I'll give you an example. When he writes his chorales, he has a walking bass in the pedal of the organ in octaves on the piano for depth. And then he would have one or two voices, mostly two or three, doing decorative, I'm improvising, but basically that's what he does too. Much better, of course. Imitational. then the long values of the sung chorale of the Lutheran worship would be on the top, ornamented. And he was improvising these at the entrance of the congregation for the worship. And then at the end of each stanza, he restarts. What does it mean? It means that we have a walking bass, a meditative middle group of voices which are played on the organ with softer stops in terms of color or timbre, motivic and imitational, and then the melody in long values. Of course, it could be when it sang 4 parts at the end of the cantata or the mass or the worship. But here it's extended with ornaments. So it overwhelms in length. It's like sits on top like some kind of a, I don't know, snowy mountain top. On the mountain, and then under it, the more earthy elements. The walking, the pacing, the seeking for the meaning of life, meaning of what it is all about, and then some kind of revealed voice, perhaps of the above. And it can last very longly like that because it's pure reflective music. Not reductive nor seductive. And do we know that Bach was only writing because of his faith? Yes, in part, for sure, if not most of the time, just because he was one faithful among many, but also partly because it was his job to convey through his music the faithful to enter in this sense of introspection and pray. It's always the duality between the craftsmanship and the art, in this case, the job or the calling, or both in one. And perhaps that's what compels us in his honesty, in his texts, in his musical texts, that talks to us, that questions us, that mirrors our yearning for this same honesty and clarity and meaning of our deeds. Bach can be seen mathematically, and of course spiritually, and of course craftsmanship-like, or for every aspect of the construction of our musical personalities. He brings it that fuel of action and interaction and reflection, and in a way a little of all for our humankind to better our humanity and elevate our spirituality. May we all try to always do better, to better ourselves, for the others, and for ourselves.